Have you ever wondered what it truly sounds like when a human soul decides to break? It is not a deafening shatter, nor is it a theatrical scream echoing into the void. No, the most devastating breaking point is entirely silent. It is the sound of someone staring into the abyss of their own demise, realizing they are utterly alone, and accepting it because they built the very walls that kept everyone else out. Imagine the suffocating stench of decaying pine mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of your own blood, knowing that if you fall here, the world will simply move on. Wolf King Stories welcomes you, ladies and gentlemen, to a journey into the darkest, most vulnerable corners of the human heart. If you find pieces of your own unspoken struggles in the tale we are about to unfold, please take a moment to subscribe and support the channel so we can continue bringing these profound stories of psychology and healing to life. The air in the deep forest was thick, ancient, and heavy, wrapping around Meva like a damp shroud. This was not a forest of fairy tales, it was a labyrinth of interwoven branches so dense that the midday sun was choked into a dim, sickly twilight. Meva walked through this suffocating darkness with deliberate, nearly silent footsteps. She was not driven by the reckless curiosity of youth or the foolish pursuit of glory. She was a woman anchored by a desperate, agonizing purpose. Deep within this lethal wilderness bloomed the Dusk fern, a rare, bioluminescent flora that held the only cure for the wasting disease slowly stripping away her mother's life. As I watch Meva navigate the treacherous underbrush, I do not just see a warrior, I see a mirror reflecting a deeply misunderstood segment of humanity. Meva's posture was a testament to a lifetime of carrying burdens that were never meant to be carried alone. Her eyes, hypervigilant and calculating, scanned the shadows. Society often looks at fiercely independent people like Meva and mislabels them. We call them arrogant, aloof, or unnecessarily guarded, assuming they refuse help out of a stubborn belief in their own superiority. But the psychological reality is infinitely more heartbreaking. For the relentlessly strong, the refusal of assistance is rarely born of pride. It is a desperate defense mechanism, forged in the agonizing fires of past betrayals and chronic disappointments. When you have spent your entire life as the foundational pillar holding up the collapsing roof of your world, the very concept of relying on another human being becomes terrifying. To ask for help is to risk the vulnerability of being dropped. So, you build a fortress. You become the caretaker, the relentless problem solver, the unbreakable wall. Yet, the tragic irony of building a wall so thick that no danger can penetrate it is that no warmth can enter either. Meva's internal fortress was absolute, convincing her that she alone must bear the weight of saving her mother. And it was this solitary conviction that led her directly into the jaws of the forest's guardian. It happened with a speed that defied logic. A blur of pure darkness detached itself from the ancient roots, a massive, sinewy aberration of fangs and night-black scales that thrived on the hubris of lone wanderers. Meva reacted with the honed, desperate instincts of a survivor, her blade flashing to parry the beast's sweeping claws. But a serrated stinger, weeping with a luminescent necrotic venom, whipped through the damp air and slashed deeply into her thigh. The pain was an immediate, blinding explosion of white-hot agony, the kind of torment that threatens to sever the mind from the body. Most would have fallen to the dirt, screaming for a savior who would never come, but Meva did not scream. Her reaction was a tragic masterclass in stoicism. Jaw clenched so hard her teeth threatened to crack, she drove her dagger into the creature's joint, forcing it to retreat into the shadows. Trembling violently, she dragged her bleeding body against the trunk of a massive oak. With cold, mechanical precision, she tore a strip of leather from her cloak and bound it ruthlessly tight above the weeping wound. She clamped down on her own agony, burying her terror beneath a mountain of sheer, agonizing willpower. In this desperate, silent struggle, Meva perfectly mirrors our modern tragedy. How many of us walk through our daily lives bleeding from invisible, psychological wounds? We are poisoned by stress, trauma, and profound exhaustion, yet we refuse to utter a single cry for help. We tighten the tourniquets on our anxiety, paint on a stoic face, and drag ourselves into our obligations, silently convincing ourselves that we must manage the venom alone. We are a generation of Mevas, sitting entirely alone in the dark, tending to our own fatal wounds in devastating silence. As Meva sat bleeding against the ancient oak, suffocating in her own silent stoicism, the brittle snap of a twig shattered the suffocating quiet of the forest. Instantly, the dagger that had just saved her life was raised again, her trembling arm locking into a desperate, defensive guard as a figure emerged from the dense underbrush. It was a man, cloaked in the muted earth tones of a seasoned tracker, his hands visibly empty, and raised in a universal gesture of surrender. His name was Kaelen, though his identity mattered little to Meva in that agonizing moment. To her fevered, trauma-wired brain, he was not a potential savior, but a catastrophic variable. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes falling to the makeshift tourniquet and the unnatural, sickly glow of the venom seeping through the leather. He offered no pitying gasps, only a calm, grounded statement that he carried an alkaline salve capable of neutralizing the beast's necrotic sting. Most people, actively dying in the dirt of a forsaken wood, would have wept with relief at the sight of a healer. Meva, however, pressed the blade tighter against her own palm, her voice a ragged, venom-laced growl demanding he step back and leave her to her task. Watching this profound resistance, I am struck by the devastating tragedy of the hyper-independent mind. Why do we fight so fiercely against the very hands attempting to pull us from the drowning waters? The answer lies in the dark, unmapped territory of human conditioning. For someone like Meva, who has endured a lifetime of being let down, abandoned, or conditionally loved, an offered hand is indistinguishable from a hidden trap. In her psychological framework, help is never truly free. It is a transaction with hidden clauses, a debt that will inevitably be leveraged against her when she is most vulnerable. Furthermore, to accept Kaelen's assistance would require her to relinquish control, and for the chronically traumatized, control is the only tether keeping them from slipping into the abyss. If she lets him touch the wound and he fails, the devastation of that misplaced hope would kill her faster than the venom. It is a profound, twisted logic born of sheer survival. It is better to die on your own terms, relying solely on your own failing strength, than to survive by placing your life in the hands of a stranger who might ultimately betray you. As the necrotic poison continued to climb her femoral artery, painting her veins a horrifying shade of iridescent violet, the physical toll began to violently clash with her psychological barricades. Kaelen did not rush her. He did not force his assistance upon her with the arrogant paternalism that so often accompanies unsolicited help. Instead, he simply knelt in the damp soil a few yards away, unpacked his satchel, and prepared the salve in absolute silence, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. This is a crucial, often overlooked element of healing the deeply wounded. You cannot batter down the doors of a fortress and expect the person inside to feel safe. You can only sit at the drawbridge and prove that you are not a threat. Yet, even in the face of this profound respect for her autonomy, Meva's internal war raged on. Every instinct screamed at her to stand, to drag her dying body deeper into the dark, to die alone rather than risk the excruciating vulnerability of needing someone. We see this every day in our own society. We watch friends, family members, and colleagues drowning in depression, suffocating under the weight of financial ruin or emotional collapse, relentlessly pushing away the very communities trying to anchor them. We convince ourselves that our burdens are too toxic, our wounds too ugly, and our existence too bothersome to inflict upon anyone else. Meva's glare, entirely feral and dimming with approaching unconsciousness, was not a look of hatred toward Kaelen. It was the terrified, agonizing look of a soul staring at the terrifying prospect of trust, realizing that the only thing more frightening than dying alone is daring to believe that you are worthy of being saved. Yet, no matter how fiercely the mind denies its need for rescue, the fragile mortal body inevitably reaches a threshold where willpower can no longer conquer biology. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic climax, but with a quiet, devastating systemic failure. The violet corruption breached Meva's core, sending a violent tremor through her spine that shattered her rigid posture and sent her slumping sideways into the dead leaves. The dagger, her lifelong symbol of unwavering self-reliance, finally slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the earth with a hollow, defeated thud. Her vision tunneled, the edges of the forest bleeding into a canvas of dark, creeping static. She was entirely exposed, physically paralyzed, and stripped of the defensive armor she had spent decades meticulously forging. In this terrifying liminal space between life and the void, Kaelen moved. He did not act with the frantic, chaotic energy of a panic-stricken bystander, but with the measured, steady grace of someone who understood that he was handling fragile, shattered glass. He knelt beside her, his presence a sudden warm gravity against the encroaching cold of the venom. It is in this exact agonizing fraction of a second that the greatest psychological metamorphosis occurs. For her entire life, Meva's core belief was a punishing mantra: if I fall, I am finished. But as Kaelen gently unspooled the crude leather tourniquet, his hands steady and devoid of judgment, the foundation of her lifelong trauma began to fracture. He did not mock her weakness. He did not reprimand her for her foolishness in wandering into the darkness alone. He simply bore witness to her agony and stepped into the breach. Through lips cracked and trembling, Meva pushed out a single fractured breath that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies to herself. Help, that one syllable, barely audible over the wind, was the loudest sound she had ever made. When I observe this moment of ultimate surrender, I want to scream to the listeners of our channel to pay close attention. Society has fed us a toxic, unforgiving lie. We have been taught that dropping our swords, sinking to our knees, and admitting we cannot go on is the ultimate manifestation of failure. We idolize the martyrs who burn themselves to ash to keep others warm. But the psychological truth is diametrically opposed to this cultural myth. Surrender, in its truest, most authentic form, is the absolute pinnacle of human courage. It requires infinitely more bravery to look another human being in the eye and admit your profound inadequacy than it does to die silently in the dark. By whispering that single word, Meva was not giving up her strength. She was finally laying down a burden she was never biologically, emotionally, or spiritually designed to carry. She was dismantling the fortress from the inside, pulling the stones down onto her own head so that the light could finally rush in. As Kaelen applied the alkaline salve, the chemical reaction was violently painful, a searing, boiling sensation as the antidote hunted down the necrotic poison in her blood. Meva arched in agony, a genuine scream finally tearing free from her throat. And for the first time in her existence, she did not muffle the sound. She allowed herself to be loud, to be broken, and to be held in her suffering. Kaelen simply anchored her by the shoulders, absorbing the shockwaves of her pain, offering a silent promise that she did not have to weather this storm in isolation. This is the raw, unvarnished anatomy of healing. It is not peaceful. It is not a gentle fading of scars. It is a violent, terrifying excavation of the soul, demanding that we finally allow another human being to touch the places where we are bleeding the most. The moment the searing agony of the antidote began to recede, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion, the paralyzing spell of her lifelong isolation was finally, irreversibly broken. Meva lay breathless against the earth, the iridescent violet fading from her veins, replaced by the sluggish but steady pulse of her own resilient blood. When she finally opened her eyes, the oppressive darkness of the forest had not changed, but her perception of it had fundamentally shifted. Kaelen was sitting quietly beside her, offering a canteen of water and a hand to help her sit up. As their fingers locked, there was no transactional weight, no unspoken debt hanging in the damp air. There was only the quiet, powerful neurobiology of co-regulation. For decades, Meva's nervous system had been trapped in a relentless state of fight or flight, a solitary apex predator constantly scanning for threats. Now, leaning heavily against a stranger who had proven himself safe, her heart rate synchronized with the calm, steady rhythm of his breathing. We are, at our most fundamental biological core, pack animals. We were never meant to process trauma, grieve deeply, or face the terrifying shadows of the world in complete isolation. When we share our pain, we do not simply have the burden, we actively alter the neurochemical landscape of our brains, flooding our systems with oxytocin and dampening the corrosive effects of cortisol. By allowing Kaelen to support her physical weight, Meva was quietly rewriting the deeply entrenched neural pathways of her own trauma. With her leg bandaged but structurally sound, the mission had to continue. Her mother's life still hung by a thread, and the Dusk Fern remained hidden in the labyrinth. But as they pressed forward into the deepening twilight, the dynamic of the journey was unrecognizable. Meva did not lead with frantic, paranoid aggression. She walked with a pronounced limp, relying on Kaelen's shoulder to navigate the treacherous, root-choked terrain. They moved as a single, coordinated entity, compensating for each other's blind spots. He tracked the subtle shifts in the soil. She read the ancient markers carved into the bark. This is the profound beauty of interdependent vulnerability. When we drop the exhausting charade of absolute self-sufficiency, we create space for others to bring their unique strengths into our lives. We stop demanding perfection from ourselves and start experiencing the grace of collective resilience. Hours later, deep within the heart of a subterranean grotto, they finally found it. The Dusk Fern clung to the damp walls of a cavern, emitting a soft, ethereal azure luminescence that pushed back the suffocating blackness. It was breathtaking, a beacon of life thriving in an environment designed for death. As Meva reached out to harvest the delicate fronds, her hands did not shake with the desperate, panicked urgency that had driven her into the forest. She harvested the plant with a quiet, profound reverence. She looked at the glowing leaves, and then she looked back at Kaelen, who was watching the cavern entrance, guarding her back without ever needing to be asked. In that glowing azure light, I see the ultimate metaphor for human connection. The Dusk Fern was the physical cure for her mother's failing body, but the journey to obtain it had provided the psychological antidote for Meva's failing spirit. She realized, with a wave of emotion that threatened to buckle her knees, that she had spent her life preparing for betrayals that never happened, building walls against monsters that were only shadows. She had starved herself of human warmth in the name of self-preservation. Holding the glowing fern, she finally understood that true survival is not about being impenetrable. It is about finding the courage to let the right people in to help you carry the fire when your own hands are too tired to hold it. With the radiant Dusk Fern safely secured in their pack and the venom neutralized, the labyrinthine forest that had once seemed like a tomb suddenly felt deeply, miraculously passable. The journey back to the village was arduous, demanding every ounce of physical stamina Meva had left, yet the psychological weight that had previously crushed her chest was completely gone. As they breached the tree line and the first golden rays of dawn spilled over the horizon, washing the world in the warm, forgiving light of a new day, Meva did not just walk out of the woods. She emerged from a lifetime of solitary confinement. They reached her mother's modest cottage just in time. The preparation of the fern, a delicate extraction of its glowing sap, was done together. When Meva pressed the cup to her mother's pale, trembling lips and watched the life-giving warmth flood back into the frail woman's cheeks, a profound, overwhelming peace settled over the room. The wasting disease was broken. Her mother would live. But as Meva stepped out onto the porch to find Kaelen waiting quietly by the fence, watching the sunrise, she realized that the most miraculous rescue of the day was not her mother's physical revival. It was her own psychological resurrection. If we pause here to look deeply into the mirror of this narrative, we must confront the central, defining thesis of our time together. We have built a modern world that fetishizes hyper-independence. We applaud the lone wolves, the grind culture, the individuals who claim they need absolutely no one to succeed. But as we have seen through Meva's harrowing journey, building a fortress out of your own pain does not make you a monarch, it makes you a prisoner. True strength is infinitely more complex, nuanced, and terrifying than simply refusing to bleed. True strength is having the profound self-awareness to recognize your own limitations. It is possessing the immense, terrifying courage to look at another human being, expose the softest, most unprotected parts of your soul, and say, "I am not okay, and I cannot do this alone." Meva walked over to Kaelen, the morning light catching the fresh, jagged scar on her thigh, a permanent physical reminder of the day she almost died of stubbornness. She did not offer him a stoic nod or a fleeting transactional thanks. She reached out, wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and embraced him, allowing herself to lean fully into the gratitude and warmth of a shared humanity. In doing so, she shattered the final remnants of her invisible walls. This brings us to the end of today's journey into the shadows of the human heart, but it is only the beginning of the reflection I ask you to undertake. Look at your own life. Identify the fortresses you have built. Ask yourself who you are keeping out in your desperate attempt to keep the pain at bay. Are you bleeding in silence, convincing yourself that your independence is worth the agony of your isolation? It is time to drop the dagger. It is time to let the drawbridge down. The world is far too dark, the forests are far too deep, and the venom of life is far too potent for any of us to wander through it alone. We are not meant to be solitary kings and queens of empty, unassailable castles. We are meant to walk together, side by side, carrying the light for one another when the shadows grow too long. Thank you for walking this path with us today. If this story resonated with the silent battles you are fighting, remember that you are deeply understood, and you are never as alone as your trauma tells you that you are. Until we meet again in the next chapter of Wolf King Stories, be brave enough to ask for help, and be kind enough to answer when someone else does.